The Pankhurst and the militant suffragette movement is seen as the main reason for women gaining the vote in 1918. But in fact, thousands of women from across the country and from every social class were involved. And they were the ones who brought the issue not just into the national media, but really down into people's day-to-day lives and got them thinking what it could mean if they were to be empowered in this way. The granting of suffrage in 1918 is in some ways attributed to the women's contribution in the war effort. What's important to see is that women who really contributed in this way were working class women in their teens and their 20s. And they were the ones challenging the sort of Victorian idea of double standards, and that women were inferior to men and incapable of carrying out the same tasks. Not the middle class conservative feminists who didn't really... They did things in the war like trying to get men to fight scripts and organise demonstrations and rallies to raise national morale, but they didn't actually contribute any way economically. The suffragists also showed that women for every class were capable of operating within a democracy. What was a problem with the militancy of the WSPU was that there were some people and groups who were really reluctant to give women the vote because they weren't sure what effect it would have upon them and whether they would become unfeminine. This is quite a late Victorian idea which carried on, that women who were empowered like this would lose their femininity and they'd become not women anymore. It's really strange, like I found one source that said that if women were to vote they would become lesbians and they would they wouldn't be able to conceive because they could vote. That's ridiculous. But the problem with all the militancy and this sensationalism and these attacks that the WSPU did is, for some people, was confirming the idea of what happened to women when they got involved in politics. And they didn't really see how people would react to the things that they were doing. Another issue was that during this time, obviously, there's a lot of insurrection in Ireland at this point. The government didn't want to be seen to be giving in to terrorists, these women who were fighting, who were setting things on fire, attacking people, and stuff like that. And they were reluctant to give in to this terrorism, and a problem with it was that it tainted the whole movement, even for women who weren't involved. Suffrage was then seen as something that was quite taboo, even if they didn't agree with setting fire to houses or poisoning people's pets and things like that. Okay, so in terms of feminism and wider emancipation, the radical suffragists and the East London Federation of Suffragettes and other groups like that we don't hear about, they really set the ground for campaigning for better lives for women, I think. Stuff like campaigning for birth control and bringing ideas like that down at a grassroots level is very important later on in more feminist movements that come prior and subsequent to the war. But the WSP were only interested in campaigning for the vote and not for wider social reform. I think that this is generally why it shouldn't be that the contribution of women from all these working class groups should be marginalised, but I think that the contribution of the WSPU and the Pankhurst should be lessened and should be seen as not as people should see that it wasn't just them and that their contribution wasn't as big as, and the only reason it was. but they weren't really involved in the suffragette movement, the WSPU, because they weren't, because of their race and their issues with that, they weren't of that social sort of, they weren't at that level, so they weren't really involved in it. But they were, from sources I found about it, in terms of the East London Federation of Suffragettes particularly, they were involved and welcomed in that respect. But I think the WSPU, I'm not sure what their policies were on race, but because it was so deeply embedded in class, in people's, lots of black or minority people would be lower class, they weren't involved in the militancy and that movement.
I'm not sure there was much of a black community in Britain at this time either, was there? I mean, the black community in Britain mainly arrived in the 50s, post-Second World War.
There are a few examples of women, black women being involved, especially in the East London Federation, but not, especially not in the mainstream thing that seems to be
And East London, I mean, it's got I think the history of kind of diverse groups of people beyond, from outside of England is quite rich. I'm by no means an expert, but so I would imagine that context would be the most fertile for kind of finding the politics around suffrage, different kinds of wings of suffragists and in relation to other groups of people.
That's true, and in fact, Emmeline and Christabel were quite reluctant for Sylvia to set up a branch there, not just because it was very working class, because they were quite afraid of all the ideas and things that were embedded within that culture, because they were trying to attract conservative feminists. They weren't trying to sort of, trying to think how to phrase it really, like bring people together from all different races and different classes. They were more just into conservative, so they didn't.
You suggested before there was a difference between the movement, the suffragette movement in England and in the United States. Want to say something about that?
I don't know that much about the movement within the United States. I know that some of the methods that were used, both by the suffragists and suffragettes, were employed in the United States, like rallies and things like that. But I'm not sure. There's a very good book by a woman called Gerda Lerner, I think it's something, putting women into social and political context. I read it quite a long time ago, and that had quite a lot about how some more conservative feminists in America distance themselves from women, certain women, in a way that WSP is. But I'm not really know much about that. That's the extent. Alright.
Anybody else?
Right,
yeah, let's give it a quick round. Five plus eight. Do you want to hack on? Do you want to have a 5-minute break? We've got to be finished by 9. I know that. Right, which is on then.